committee who brought us together. Thanks to this extraordinary host group that has, I think it's safe to say, exceeded expectations for what a Democratic presidential candidate can do in Nashville. And I want to thank Jeff, who's being characteristically modest, but was really the first out of a cohort of a generation of people I knew in college. Many of whom I thought were suited to public service, but many of whom found an easier path. And to see him go home, decide to make himself useful, find a way to respectfully but also energetically assert the importance of a new generation of leadership stepping forward. And then after he got elected and I got elected, finding ourselves in a community of young electeds, often from red states, who come together to talk about how to make sure we move things forward for our party and for our country. Somebody who really paved the way for a lot of others. So thanks, so I'm honored to have you. And I really think it's in this part of the country and in my part of the country that we're going to fashion the vocabulary that's going to change the political era that we're living in. I'm convinced that, and this is part of why I'm running, is that we're living in this moment that even now we're probably underreacting to how serious and how consequential it is. And it's because, as shocking as the things emanating from the White House are, that is a symptom. A White House like this doesn't just happen. It happens when there are tectonic shifts under us, an accelerating pace of disruptive change in our economy, our politics, and our society that require urgent attention at the deepest level. And when we're dealing with something like that, we've got to recognize that what we're doing now isn't just about the next election. It is about the next era. It is about setting a course for where America is going to head, such that the behavior of Democrats and Republicans in office over the balance of this half century may well come down to what happens in the next 3 years. And that in turn calls on us to talk not just about the policies and the characters who are in the public view, but really about the values that motivate us to do any of this in the first place. And I am seeking to put an end to the Republican monopoly on the word values. So many of the values that animate us, they're not conservative values, they're American values that I believe often have progressive implications. First among them being freedom, which is talked about as though all there were to freedom was cutting a tax somewhere. But we know that you lack freedom if you don't have health care and don't have the chance to live the American dream, go start a small business because you're afraid leaving your old job means you lose your coverage. Health care is part of freedom too. By the way, reproductive rights is part of freedom in this country. I think freedom in this country comes by way of access to quality education, which is why we ought to have a Secretary of Education who believes in public education. And I don't think anyone is free so long as a county clerk gets to tell them who they ought to marry just based on their interpretation of their law. Nor is anybody free so long as we live in a country where your race can predict your life expectancy, your income, your educational outcomes, and your experience with the criminal justice system. Until we fix that, all of us are less free. So now's our chance to change the conversation about freedom. It's a chance to change the conversation about faith and assert for all to see that voters of faith have a choice and that God does not belong to a political party. Don't get me wrong, we're going to stand for people of any religion and of no religion because that's how it works when you're in public office. We're also going to let people who are guided by religious values know that they don't have to check those values at the door and be on board with a president whose personal character, needless to say, flies in the face of a lot of what we hear on Sunday morning, but also whose policies are designed to afflict the afflicted and comfort the comfortable, and we have a chance to do it the other way around like it ought to be. So it's time for a new conversation about faith, about freedom, and also about security. I'm also pretty sure that the flag that was Velcroed to my shoulder when I stepped off that C-17 at Bagram Airfield was not a Republican flag, it was an American flag.
Yes.
And by the way, part of what that flag stood for is that each of us is entitled to be critical of our nation's leaders without anybody telling us to go back to where we came from or question our ability. Security, but let's talk about what's going to affect us in the 21st century. Not just a rise of China that's going to have to be dealt with more than just a president poking them in the eye to see who can export more dishwashers, but an actual plan to be competitive in the 21st century. We've got to actually have a plan to deal with things like cybersecurity and election security that cannot be resolved by putting up a wall from coast to coast. We're going to have to respond to the simple reality that security in the 21st century includes naming and confronting white nationalist violence that has come to our shores and claimed lives right here in the United States. And coming from a river city, I can tell you, you don't have to be on the coasts to know that climate disruption is a national security challenge and deserves to be taken seriously. Now, what I find when I talk about these issues is that pretty much everyone in our party is on the same page, and there's a lot of Republicans of conscience who are finding their way to a new place as well. And the real question on a lot of folks' minds, especially when I'm talking to people from my side of the aisle, is, okay, that's great, we're pretty much on the same page there. How are we going to win? And this is another area where I think it's so important to have the conversation in this part of the country. Because I go to some parts of the country where there are people I agree with and they're great. They have trouble believing that Trump voters even exist. It's just such an exotic thing to them. Right? But we know people, our neighbors, our people we care about, they get that look in their eye. And we got to recognize that even though this president is deservedly very unpopular, it is also entirely possible for him to win again. Yep. And part of how he wins again is if they can make us look like we are the defenders of the system. Like we're just going to take everything back to the old normal. Like we're offering a return to the 90s to match this president's offer of a return to the 50s. And that's not a promise that we can keep, and we shouldn't try. Because this is not about going back to normal. Normal didn't work. We wouldn't be here as a country, politically, if there weren't millions of people, including in my part of the industrial Midwest, for whom the rising tide did not lift all boats, and normal let a lot of people down. So we got to decide what the new normal is going to look like. And if we get the new normal right, on the basis of those values I talked about, and by the way, also on the basis of a democracy that is actually a democracy, like one where dollars can't outvote people, and one where politicians don't draw districts to choose their own voters. Maybe even one where we choose our nation's leader by just counting up all the votes and giving it to the person who got the most. You know, that kind of democracy. That in turn delivers a new normal, so that when my eyes are always on 2055. That's the year, God willing, that I reach the current age of the current president. I kick up my heels and retire. And my kids and grandkids ask me, what did you do now? What did you do in 2020? Yes. We're going to be held accountable. We will, in fact, be judged for what we do. But we will be able to say, if we get this right, that these were the years when we made the choices that brought about a world where we didn't have to look over our shoulder whether every choice we made was wrecking the climate and making it impossible to continue prospering in our time. When gun violence was an exotic and rare occurrence, not a routine one, least of all in our schools. When a black driver and a white driver who sees a police officer feels the exact same thing, and that it is a feeling of safety, not one of fear. We have a chance to deliver that kind of reality and live in it, but only if we make these right choices right now. And that's why I'm running for president, with your help. invited you to, not just to support the campaign, but hopefully to help shape it. And I'd love to have a conversation with the time that we have about whatever you think is of interest or any questions I can answer about what we're up to and why. Yes, ma'am.
I actually, I'm from rural West Tennessee, which is essentially like I'm a very small blue dot in a very large red sea. So, and y'all don't judge me, my husband is a Trump supporter. So you can imagine the conversations we have at the dinner table. Particularly in rural, the county I live in is economically at risk. It's very rural, it is poor. Like it is poor AF. So like how do like no kidding, dudes. So like how do, but they consistently vote against their self-interest. And I think your candidacy is the one that I understand why this happened. And it's what attracted me to you. What is help me create a dialogue to like, help me help them.
Well, keep chipping away on I think, we can build a message, and it's not even about pretending to be more conservative than we are. I think so much just depends on talking in terms of these values that we talked about, but also talking in terms of everyday life. How your life's going to go different if we get this right. That continuing to make life better for those who are already best off isn't going to make a difference in rural Indiana or rural Tennessee. That we are losing hospitals, losing population, losing hope. And a lot of folks are losing their identity, too. And even if we can figure out a way to substitute their income, we haven't figured out a way to substitute the sense of community and identity and purpose that came with a relationship to the workplace that's totally changed. And that's happening in the industrial Midwest where I am, and it's happening in rural America, too. And we got to speak to that by, first of all, demonstrating that we get it. Demonstrating that we're committed to these bread and butter issues. Here's a good example. On tomorrow, they're going to have a vote in Washington on what I think is one of the most important pieces of legislation all year, and it's barely been spoken about. It's a raise to the minimum wage. It's a pathway to $15 by 2025. Huge deal. Nobody's talking about it. Why? Because we're dealing with the racist tweets, right? And we got to figure out how to do both. We can talk about that. We should, because you got to name that and confront it. But it's an example of how the more we're talking about him, the less we're talking about you. And so we got to make sure this is a policy that's broadly popular in red and blue states. Make sure people get paid more. We're the ones trying to make sure you get paid more. We're the ones trying to make sure you can have health care. And we know we were right on that because even a Republican Congress couldn't get rid of it when the time came. Right? Amen. So the more we're talking about things in terms of real life, instead of the kind of show that's on there, right? And it's hard to look away from a show, especially that kind of show, right? But if we go on a show, we're already losing. It's why we got to change the channel to a different conversation. The other thing I think really matters is just to show up. It's why I'm here. I got a lot of questions from quizzical Tennessee journalists saying, what are you doing here across the course of the day? But if they don't hear from us, then if you're on different media circuits, you might never hear our message. It was controversial within the party when I decided to do a town hall on Fox News. But I figured there's millions of people who I might not be able to blame for ignoring our message if they never heard it in the first place. And so, and by the way, I didn't change up my message. The message that got me a standing ovation at the Fox News town hall is the same one I would use on MSNBC. We got to also recognize people are not as tribal and ideological as they used to be, unless they feel like they're under attack. And if they feel like we're putting a finger in their face, right, saying you're bad and you were complicit in a crime, and you're a fool going against your interests, then I think we back them into a corner. We got to make them feel good about themselves as they come to our side of the
I have no doubt that in a head-to-head match, you would beat Donald Trump. How do we get you to the nomination?
All right.
When we have so many other candidates who are rushing to the left, and we have so many friends that are supporting that particular position. Mm-hmm. But what you just said resonates. So how do we get those Democrats on board?
Yeah. So what we found is that the more people hear our message, the better we do. And we got a nice high ceiling because there's still tons of people who, even though I flatter myself by thinking I'm all over the place, there's still tons of people who haven't heard of us at all, right? I mean, a lot of people don't have time to tune into the blow-by-blow of the nominating process. But what we're seeing is very few people are stuck on one nominee just yet. And so the field is really wide open. Now, part of what I need help with is what you're doing right now, which is gathering the resources that then get immediately plowed into the ground in the form of organizers, especially in places like Iowa, where we just went over 50 people on the ground, South Carolina, Nevada, New Hampshire, you name it. So that's part of it. Part of it's helping to extend our reach into the broadest coalition possible. We got to make sure that we are inviting people who won't find their way to us. We got to find our way to them to be part of this, and again, to shape it, not just to help. We're in particular working very hard to make sure we have gotten the message out about the Douglas plan. This is intended to be as ambitious as the Marshall. It's based on the awareness that we're not going to get where we need to get in racial equality in this country if we just take a racist set of policies and replace it with a neutral set of policies. We've got some work to do to restore. And that means in health, home ownership, entrepreneurship, criminal justice, democracy, so many different fields, education. We gotta have concrete plans on how we're going to deliver equality. We've put that forward. It gets great reviews wherever we take it, but we got to make sure we've done our work to make sure people hear it. So broadening that base is going to be really important. And we are now in what you might call the marathon stage. It's when you realize just how long the race is. So the first 6 months we're getting up and running, it's blast off, we're excited. The last 6 months, from January to the convention, that's all adrenaline. We're in between. And this is really when races can be won or lost, because this is when we do that kind of patient building out of our message. But we're structuring our campaign around relational organizing. It means reaching out into your networks and inviting people, because the most powerful predictor of whether somebody's going to respond is not whether they hear from me, it's whether they hear from somebody they know. That's got enormous power. And I can feel the untapped support and potential, especially among Democrats who live in conservative states, who just haven't heard from a lot of presidential candidates coming to see them. That's a huge part of how we can win too. So with your help, I'm convinced we've gotten this far. We've, the questions I got in January were, are you really sure you can make it into the top 20 by the time the debate cut off? Now we're just consolidating where we are on the top of the field, top tier, and now we've got to move to the top of that heap, and that's what the next few months are about.
Has appointed, has that created another adversary for a Democratic president now?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. They have locked in a judiciary that's pretty far out from where most of the American people are. And that's a Senate elected by a minority of Americans, ratifying judges appointed by a president elected by a minority of Americans who are going to oppose that view for a while. But I think we also have a chance, well, first of all, that's why we need to get a new president real quick. It's also why I've talked about judiciary reform, and I don't do it lightly, and I don't come to it believing I have all the answers. But I think we need to be ready to entertain structural processes that America does from time to time. Not so much to keep the court from being too far right, even though it certainly is, but to stop this slide toward being viewed as a nakedly political institution. If we don't do something about that, we lose the one branch that's supposed to stand above the political fray. You can see it happening now. If every vacancy is an apocalyptic ideological firefight, there's not going to be much left of the courts. And so we got to be ready to think about structure as well as personnel when we're getting that right for the generation to come.
Hi, Mayor. My name is Justin. I wanted to ask about education. I wanted to ask if you supported taxpayer-funded college, and if so, why? And if so, if not, why not? Because right now, I feel like the college education and tuition is far outbalanced by what we have the ability to pay. Because right now we have a 13-year-old son, and we're struggling to actually keep a college education fund for him so that he doesn't have to leave college with a degree and a huge amount of debt that he may or may not be able to pay off. So I would like your views on what you could do as president to solve that problem.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing over the course of a half century what's happened. My grandfather was a career military officer, and he wanted to see to it that his grandson would not have to pay anything for college. And so he took out the princely sum of $1,000 and put it in a savings bond, figuring that would pretty much do the trick. He didn't live to see me get into college, but if he did, he would have been alarmed, I think, at how quickly the textbooks alone ate up that modest endowment. Look, we cannot see the American dream continue to develop if college is out of reach for this many Americans. The number one, by the way, you can measure very concretely the American dream. You just count up how many people make it from the bottom fifth to the top fifth. Number one place to live the American dream right now is Denmark. We're not even in the top 10. And part of this is college affordability. It's also personal for me because as a household, Chas and I have six-figure debt. And there are several steps that we can take to deal with this. An expanded public service loan forgiveness program, a state-federal partnership to drive down tuition costs. I believe we can get it to where college is tuition-free for low and middle-income students and much more affordable for everybody else. We should also dramatically expand Pell Grants, and this time, peg it to inflation, so you don't have to go back to the well all the time, and make it possible to use it for living expenses, so that even those for whom we've taken care of tuition are also able to get through what is often the biggest barrier, which is living costs. Now, where I stop short is I don't believe that we need to pay all the way down to the last dollar for the child of a billionaire with it being totally free. I don't think that's a promise we can keep. And I don't think it's progressive. But I do think that we need to make sure that it is more affordable on the front end, that there are more ways to deal with debt on the back end, and that it's not a barrier for anybody who ought to be going to college. Now, the other thing I think we ought to do, in addition to making it much more affordable to go to college, make it more affordable to not go to college. You shouldn't have to go to college in order to be able to live well in this country. There's one reason why okay, great, go ahead.
What laws would you want passed to help separate money from politics?
Right, great question. Separating money from politics. So there are some things we can do right away. We can at least shine a light on dark money. This is part of H.R. 1, the anti-corruption, pro-democracy bill that the House passed that then, like so many good bills, went to the Senate and died there. I would definitely revive that. I think that federal funding and public funding for elections done in the right way would empower individuals to have more of a voice. I also believe that at the end of the day, we may need to look at this from a constitutional perspective. Right? The Supreme Court, I believe Citizens United was a disaster for our democracy. And the Supreme Court basically said that a corporate actor has the soul of a person for the purposes of politics. And I don't believe that's what the First Amendment says. But if that really is true, then we ought to clear that up. Now, some folks think that's way far out, pie in the sky, that we would do that. Even though most Americans, including people on the other side of the aisle, think we need to do something about money in politics. And my response is that the most elegant feature of our Constitution is that you can renew it. It's built in. And we used to do that every few years, up until the 70s, and then we just stopped. We just missed an entire season of reform. And we have a chance now, I think, to do something about it. It might take years and years and years to win that fight. But in a country that changed the Constitution, within the lifetime of my grandparents, changed the Constitution so you couldn't drink, and then decided that was a bad idea and changed it back. I'm pretty sure we can at least entertain structural remedies to defend our democracy from things like this. There must be some women who have questions. Must be the guys. All the way in the back.
What are your plans for early education and how you can solve it now?
Early education. Yes, thank you for that. So it's like a three-legged stool. There's making sure there's enough seats there to begin with, that there's more early education opportunities. That's part one. Part two is making sure the quality is there, because that's half the battle. And there's some interesting data from Tennessee on that. And then the third is making sure that it's actually affordable to go into the field of being an early educator or provider. And the reality is, any two of those will make it harder to get the third done unless we have federal intervention. which is why we're going to have federal support for pre-kindergarten education in this country. And when we do, unlike some of the other things that we've been told would pay for themselves, like tax cuts on the very wealthiest, this really is something that has been demonstrated to pay for itself. The payoff to this, in terms of earnings, in terms of not just people earning more, people being less likely to wind up in the criminal justice system just by virtue of having had the right start in life, is huge. There is no reason not to do this. And it's an investment that most people are ready to make. And again, if we want to keep up with China, for example, this is not just about tariffs. This is about making sure we're making those right investments in people at the very beginning of their lives and making it affordable before they even get to the education level to have childcare, which we can use the tax credit system to do. Because I meet way too many people on the trail who work for the purpose of earning enough to be able to pay for childcare for the purpose of being able to work. It's, in the military, we call that a self-licking ice cream cone. And it doesn't make any sense, and there should be support, but that means the federal picture actually recognizing and valuing what's going on when it comes to raising our youngest. So thanks so much for being part of this. I'm really honored to have you.